Oh, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Correllian Tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and they will appear here in my chat room, and we can communicate directly. And yesterday was the Sabbat of Emil and Lunasa, depending on the hemisphere that you're in. Um, Today is the date of Groundhog's Day, also the Christian version of Candlemas, and the birthday of the beloved Lady Bitterwind. And I thought I would talk a little bit about Bitterwind today. I've talked about her on a number of occasions. But since it's her birthday, and hello to Reverend Michael in the chat room. It's good to see you, Michael. I thought today would be a good one. Bitterwind was part of my life from a very early period. And hello to Christine in the chat room. And hello to Tom in the chat room. It's good to see you, Tom. And she remained part of my life up until she crossed into spirit during the last lustration in Danville. Hello to Antonio in the chat room. It's good to see you, Antonio. Lady Bitterwind was a remarkable person. She was a Discordian, and she introduced a lot of interesting ideas into the Correllian tradition. She was very concerned with what she called the witchness of the why. And she was very focused on the idea that if you want to understand deity, you look at what deity has done. And what has deity done? Well, that's the whole world around you. So if you really want to understand deity, you don't read what people have written. You read what exists in the world. And hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. And that is where you will see what deity is all about. And she looked at this in a variety of ways. She was very connected to nature, very concerned with natural cycles. And she spoke a great deal. And hello to Vidi in the chat room. It's good to see you, Vidi. Wrote a great deal about the importance of understanding the cycle of predation and prey in nature. That if your idea of nature was, for want of a better way to put it, like a Disney cartoon of nature, you were not actually honoring nature at all. You were eviscerating it. That nature is a place with happy things and not so happy things, all in an intricate balance. And hello to Steve in the chat room. And Steve is from West Virginia. Good to see you, Steve. And to understand nature, to understand deity, you can't just look at the happy things and you can't just look at the sad things. You have to look at the balance that's created between them. You can't just look at life. You can't just look at death. You have to look at the balance that's between them. You cannot you can focus on one thing to try to understand that thing better, but you cannot eliminate the other things from your understanding and think you have an understanding. And a lot of people do that. A lot of people really only want to look at the happy, funny things, the kind of fuzzy things that give warm, fuzzy feelings when they look at nature. And they forget the extent to which life feeds on death, and that death is nature in itself, that life, to survive, must have death as part of that equation. And understanding this is a big part of understanding life. This was one of Lady Bitterwind's major themes. She was a great believer in understanding that you must look at both what we would call good and what we would call bad, and that neither of those definitions on our part actually makes the thing either good or bad. That deity, the universe, eternity, they look at these things in their own way that is not dependent on how convenient or how warm and fuzzy it may be for us. And this, I think, is a vital thing to understand spiritually. When we talk about things like the idea of divine justice, um, it's incredible hubris for us to think that any concept of divine justice would be based on our individual standards. We're only a tiny part of the world, and our ideas of what are good and bad are extremely flexible and often extremely selfish. I've spoken many times about the idea of how people really simplify their ideas of good and bad according to what works for them. But if you look back 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, what most people thought was good or bad is not the same as what people would say today. And they were just as certain that their concepts were universal as we are now. And so I think it's very important, and I get this attitude a lot from Lady Bitterwind, that we must not confuse our temporary uh, understandings and attitudes for being universal or cosmic. They are how we see things from where we are. And that was part of her Discordian energy. Um, she was a great believer in not accepting the way most people looked at things. Now, Lady Bitterwind was also very well known as an artist. Most of the time that I knew her, she was best known as an artist. Uh, when we, when I first met Lady Bitterwind, she was known as an artist and a little bit of a writer in science fiction fandom. And this was in the early 70s. It was well before the second coming of Star Trek. And it was during that period when Star Trek fandom really kept the idea of a return of Star Trek alive. And I don't know that it's possible to compare that to anything today, but there was a huge fandom around this then old show that no one thought would ever come back, but people hoped. And all kinds of zines and artwork and other things being produced, and she produced a lot of it. Um, and quite a bit of it came under the heading of slash fiction, which was basically homoerotic fiction involving the characters of Kirk and Spock, and that was her favorite. She was very big in slash fiction, but a lot of people were at that time, and um, it was an interesting period. But as she went forward, she started to focus more on pagan artwork. And as we came to the end of the old century and the beginning of the new, she became very involved in a new form of artwork, very different from what she'd done before. She'd been an illustrator, occasionally a painter, and she did black and white illustrations, similar to what I have done so many of. Um, but she got a new inspiration, and that was to take old items that she might find at a rummage sale or a thrift shop and create new things from them to express her spiritual understanding of the world. And she would take anything from old bottles, old decorative elements, old cups, old animal images, and put them together in new ways, sometimes with original artwork, to illustrate the things that she felt were important. One of the ones that we used to have displayed quite often was called, after the famous poem, Death Shall Have No Dominion. And it showed a skeleton made of resin dancing among the stars, which were made of a silver garland wrapped around it with a macrame base. Um, all items someone had thrown out because they didn't think they were any good anymore. And she put them together into a very evocative piece of artwork. She did a number of pieces of artwork involving skeletons in this way, representing the spirit of individuals, the spirit of the universe, and its continuing nature. One that she was very proud of had the skeleton involved with an actual living plant. as part of the artwork. And the idea was to represent how life comes forth from death, how one thing must move on for the space to open for new life. And that was also a very evocative piece of art, but she did so very many different kinds of pieces of art. Some of them very individual, some of them, well, all of them very individual, but some individual from each other, others very typical of her style. And the thing that she liked about this form of art was that she saw it also as a form of upcycling. That she was taking things that people thought were ugly or useless or no longer important and making something new and valuable from them, that people would love as artwork. And people did love her artwork. And in fact, if you have her artwork, you have a collector's item because obviously no more is coming. Um, and she did hundreds of pieces, beautiful pieces. Um, I have a few here at the house, and there are many others in different parts of the country. The beloved Lady Windy LaJoy had probably the largest collection of Lady Bitterwind art, other than Lady Bitterwind herself, or the Correllian tradition itself, and maybe even more so then. But her artwork was very evocative of the things that she was trying to convey. And she tried to involve in every piece of her artwork a symbol for each of the four elements. Um, Commonly, this included a seashell, a feather, um, often a lizard or a snake for fire, and often a spider for earth, though it might be other things for earth as well. So if you look at her artwork, very often you'll see these themes, even if they're very small parts of the artwork, because she wanted to reference the elements in everything that she did. And it was quite beautiful artwork. Um, Lady Bitterwind, as I say, she was a Discordian. She did not accept things in the way that they necessarily appeared. She was always trying to look beneath the surface and always trying to look for the deeper way of seeing them. And I think that is a very important thing for all of us to do. There are people who are very concerned with how things look on the surface, but never reconsider what they think they've seen. And I mentioned earlier the idea of a Disney movie about nature. Disney movies are wonderful. Bambi is a wonderful film. Is it a great film about nature? Certainly not actual nature. That doesn't detract anything from its value as a film. But nature has far more terrible moments in it than anything you're going to see in most animated films. Um, Most animals are at some point or another in their lives either going to eat each other or be eaten, because this is part of what nature is all about. And if it doesn't happen in their lives, it will happen after their death. The new world is built on the old world. The very soil we walk on is built of the decomposed bodies of our predecessors, whether it's the leaves that have fallen from the trees, the animals who have died in the forest, our remote human ancestors. Eventually, the vast majority all devolve into the soil, where they give life through the nutrients of their bodies to new creatures that grow in the earth, to the plants that are ultimately the basis of most life on earth. But to forget where that soil comes from is to miss an important part of life. And that is very much a Bitterwindism. And I think an important part of how we look at life. If you remember the programs I was doing around Thanksgiving, I was talking about the importance for me of always naming the turkey that you're going to have at your Thanksgiving feast, so that you remember that it and everything else you're serving was once alive. And even if you are vegetarian or vegan, choose something else to name because those plants were also alive. It is the nature of life that it is temporary in its individual elements in order to be eternal as a whole. And I don't think we can speak of ourselves as worshiping or honoring nature if we don't acknowledge that fact about nature. And a lot of us tend to not always really think about that. And of course, we don't necessarily want to always think about that, but we want to remember it, particularly when it's relevant. When I was a young man doing artwork, often, um, and Lady Bitterwind would usually see my artwork before I published it. That's how the Tarot of Hecate came to be. But one of the criticisms that some people had of a lot of the artwork that appeared in the pagan press at that time was that they felt it showed Barbie goddesses, that the portrayals of the divine feminine um, tended to somewhat resemble Barbie dolls. And I was always at great pains not to do that, to show a much wider diversity um, and realism in the images that I was trying to get out there. And that also has something to do with these attitudes on Lady Bitterwind's part. In fact, I was raised with them. If you look at her own artwork, you would never suggest that she created any Barbie goddesses. She very much created, when she was doing illustration, she created images of people as individuals with all of the things that made them individual, not highly idealized. And her attitude toward the world was the same. Now, Bitterwind, her actual name was Virginia Smith. She was often called Ginny. I always called her Virginia because I just am that way. Uh, but her spiritual name was Bitterwind because she was born on this day in a particularly cold winter. And when she found a need for a spiritual name, she thought of that and said, anyone born on the 2nd of February should be named Bitterwind. And that's what she called herself. But did it actually fit her? Well, in the sense that she did like to bust illusions. I suppose you could think of it that way, but I never particularly found her wind to be particularly bitter, rather clarifying. And I think that when we look at our spirituality, when we look at our lives, we need to look at it in that sort of no holds barred sort of way, to look beyond the comfortable assumptions, to look beyond what is convenient to our moment, and to see things perhaps from a more existential perspective. I was speaking earlier about the concept of divine justice. I am a believer in the idea of karma, although I believe karma works through attachment, more in the Buddhist idea than, say, the Hindu idea um, of karma. But I also believe in divine justice, and I do not see these two things as being at all related. Karma is about the lessons of life and what you attach to, but I do believe there is a kind of divine justice, but it is not necessarily readily understood by us because it has that existential viewpoint. It isn't what's most convenient um, for Reverend Don in Danville today. It's what's necessary for the earth to go forward, for the universe to go forward. What is it that will keep the balance of the web of existence? And people often say, how can there be just deities when this or that evil thing happens in the world? Well, it might seem evil to us because we're in it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's evil from a divine perspective. I actually don't believe in the concept of evil for a variety of reasons. That would be a totally different program. But we can speak of good and bad. But because something might be bad for us to live through in that moment, doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for the universe. doesn't necessarily mean it's bad from a divine perspective. Um, and if we look at nature, when the antelope is brought down by the lion and eaten by the lion, it's not happy for the antelope. The antelope is not pleased with this. I am quite certain. But for the lion, it's a good thing. And there is a part of it which is necessary to maintain that web of life. I remember once having known a man um, who was a very nice man, loved nature as he understood it, which was in a rather stylized way. One day he happened to see a program, a documentary about nature in which I think it was a wildebeest came across a baby lion and recognizing it as a lion, destroyed it. And he could not understand how this could be possible in the world of all the innocent animals, um, because he really didn't know nature at all. Now, one of the things that I think happens to people, and this too is part of my legacy from Lady Bitterwind, I think a lot of people end up disoriented in life, disappointed in life, um, sometimes feeling hopeless in life because they were given very false expectations of life. Like my friend with the wildebeest. Um, so often, parents and society as a whole try to teach children not what the world is, but what they think it should be. And then when the children grow up and find out the world isn't that at all, they find themselves very disillusioned. I think that we need to have a more honest understanding of who we are, of what our society is like, and of what life is like, and stop trying to Victorianize it. Stop trying to Balderize it. Um, and, say, life is a balance of many different things, some of which seem good when we experience them, some of which seem bad when we experience them, but they are all part of an intricately balanced web. Um, and I think we would all be happier if we had that more existential point of view. I know that many times in my own life, being able to look at things that way has helped me to deal with situations I have faced. Um, and I think that it can be a very valuable skill to possess. Lady Bitterwind was a very outspoken person. She usually could make her point very directly, and usually did. One of the things I remember about her, and you'll have to be very old to understand what I'm about to refer to, but there was once a man named Dan Quayle who was a vice president of the United States. I know this is ancient history. No one remembers this person now because they did nothing else in their life that I know of. But back in the day, it was somewhat important. And this person was giving a rally in the Danville public school system that no one had bothered to tell the parents about. And a number of parents who perhaps came from a different political background didn't think this was really right. Oh, and Tom remembers this, yay! Uh, and they gathered downtown to protest. And nobody cared. The cameras never turned to them. Nobody was interviewing them. But Lady Bitterwind was one of those protesters. She did not like Dan Quayle. She did not like Dan Quayle at all. And she decided that the way to get themselves on the news, to let the people see that there were people who disagreed with this, with involving the school children in this political act, was not universally approved of, was to start dancing in the picket line. That is exactly what she did. She started to dance. holding her picket sign. And the cameras moved. Suddenly, they were on television. Suddenly, their concern became known to the area. Did it make any difference? That's a whole other question. But she did the thing that was necessary to make people see. And that's very much how she was. She knew how to do that necessary thing to make her point. And when I think of Lady Bitterwind, these are some of the things I think of. Another example, which I guess I will go ahead and give. There's a picture from one of the illustrations, maybe 15 years ago, of Lady Bitterwind kneeling with the illustration water in a cauldron while the ancestors are blessing it. This was not anything that anyone suggested that she should do. She was to stand there holding the cauldron, but she felt that it was more appropriate that she kneel. And she did this. And it was very appropriate, and it created a wonderful image, and it took 2 people to get her back up. But she did what she felt was necessary. She did what she felt was right. And I've always thought that was a very admirable thing about her. The last thing that I think I will say, since I see we're coming close to the end of our half hour, Lady Bitterwind died just before the last lustration in Danville. She died actually on Beltane. And it took a few days for us to be informed that this had happened. People wondered why she had not come, but she was facing some health issues at that time that did explain that. So Lady Crystal and I, who were together that weekend, weren't really worried about it. We knew she wasn't necessarily in good enough health to come. But that Sunday night, we went to the cemetery to have a ceremony honoring the ancestors and to collect a little bit of graveyard dirt for veneration of the ancestors. And as soon as we got there, as we're walking through the cemetery, an owl flies by and starts to hoot, which is, as I understand it, a symbol of death or sometimes change. Now, one of the people with us said, no, this has a different meaning for me. It doesn't necessarily mean that. So we went along, went to the different ancestral tombs, paid our respects, gathered at Caroline's tomb, and just then, Lady Crystal's phone rings, and she has to excuse herself while the ceremony goes on. And it turns out that that's when she was informed that Lady Bitterwind had crossed. So the owl had been an omen, and the fact that we found this just as we're doing the largest ceremony of ancestor veneration for that weekend other than lustration itself has always been to me a very meaningful thing. And Christine, hello Christine in the chat room, she says it's a wonderful talk and an awesome tribute to Lady Bitterwind. Thank you, Christine. So with that, we have come to the end of our half hour. I want to thank you for joining us. And Midday with Rev Don will be going forward on Correllian TV. Watch for announcements on my Facebook page. I'm not certain if I'll be doing a program on Monday or not, but we will be picking up next week. I might take Monday off. But I want to thank you. And today at 2 p.m. Central, there will be further announcements being made here on Pagan World TV of all the different things happening. And I hope that you have a lovely day, and I hope you have a lovely weekend. And let us close as we always do with our prayer. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. And we ask you to always be with us and help us to move forward and help us to acknowledge the effects of those people who enrich our lives the most and who enrich our lives in every way. Help us to acknowledge the delicate balance of nature around us and within us, and to work always for the best expression of the force of life in the world. Let us remember that life always goes forward, and let us play our role in carrying it forward. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks, and knowing you are always with us, From respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always.